Hi, my name is Juliane Schmüser. I'm from CISPA Helmholtz Center for Information Security, and I am very happy to present today our work analyzing security and privacy advice during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine on Twitter on behalf of all of my wonderful co-authors. I would like to begin with a demonstration of the effect that the invasion has had on the digital security and privacy threat and advice landscape. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, many digital threats appeared alongside the physical ones. There was misinformation, scams and phishing, attacks on Ukraine, attacks that influenced individuals' security and privacy, internet outages and attacks on critical infrastructure, governmental websites taken down, and attacks on refugees. To address these new threats, a lot of new resources appeared online. There were guides on how to stay safe, how to combat misinformation, news articles along the lines of X steps to stay safe, different governmental advisories, tips from tech companies, and finally individuals that shared advice on social media such as Twitter. Looking at this wealth of new resources, we asked ourselves the following research questions. 1. What security and privacy advice was shared on Twitter related to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine? To answer this, we created a taxonomy of the advice. And second, how does the advice compare to security and privacy advice that was shared in other contexts? To answer this, we compare our taxonomy to the findings of prior work. So how did we collect and analyze security and privacy advice related to the invasion on Twitter? You can see here an overview of our methodology, which consisted of two different phases of data collection, followed by data analysis. In our first exploratory data collection phase, we considered tweets between February and May 2022. We collected them using the Twitter Academic API and Twint and TweePy libraries. We automatically filtered them using search terms that were based on our experience as security and privacy researchers, as well as a small set of initial relevant tweets. We then manually evaluated 8,920 tweets, finding 232 that contained security and privacy advice and were related to the invasion. We additionally extracted 140 documents containing advice that these tweets linked to. We then performed a second verifying data collection to evaluate if we had missed any topics in our exploratory search. We here considered tweets between February 2022 and February 2023. Using a 1% sample of Twitter, we used a semi-automatic, data-driven approach to generate search terms that were based on the seed terms cybersecurity, advice, and recommend. We manually reviewed 1,000 tweets, finding 74 additional relevant tweets and extracting 32 new relevant documents. However, we did not find any new topics and thus consider our dataset to have reached saturation. To categorize the advice, we used a mixed coding approach. We curated our initial codebook from prior work on security and privacy advice. We then iteratively refined and expanded it as new codes emerged from the data. We finally used a collaborative affinity diagramming session to establish 7 categories and 21 subcategories from our 224 unique codes. In this next part of the talk, I am going to present the taxonomy of advice and give some examples for the different advice categories. First, for some context, we coded advice for who it was from and who it was for. Advice-giving actors were companies, non-profit organizations, governments, news agencies, and individuals, with individuals posting most of the advice. For targets, we distinguished between individuals and organizations, and further distinguished if the advice addressed those in Ukraine, in specific other countries, or did not specify any target audience. Most advice was in this last category of not specifying any target audience. You can see here an overview of our advice categories and how often they appeared by target audience. The most common category was messaging and social media, which heavily focused on individuals. There was a similar distribution for safe online behavior, which also appeared often. Finally, a common advice category was learning and teaching, which focused on giving advice and learning and teaching security and privacy. Let's look at some examples. In the category messaging and social media, most social media focused on privacy and privacy settings. For messaging, most discussions were around securing communications and which services to use or not to use for that. This included warnings such as Telegram and Viber are not really encrypted and that branding may literally cost lives. A lot of the discussion around whether or not one should use Telegram focused on the fact that this does not enable encryption by default. Other discussed messengers included Signal and WhatsApp. Also in this category of advice was misinformation. While most of it was generic, one statement related directly to the messenger discussion. Following claims that Signal had been breached, Signal replied, "This is false. Signal is not hacked. We believe these rumors are part of a coordinated misinformation campaign meant to encourage people to use less secure alternatives." In the category Safe Online Behavior, malware threats were a prevalent topic, and while most advice focused on traditional distribution channels such as email attachments, there were some new ones associated with the war. There was, for example, this warning about a malware that disguised itself as a DDoS tool meant to allow civilians to take part in cyber attacks against Russia. Another prevalent topic were phishing and scams that were important for individuals and organizations alike. These mostly focused on receiving suspicious emails or clicking on suspicious links. Finally, in this category, there were anonymous online connections and circumvention of censorship, with one user likening the Tor browser to the hidden antennas that people used to receive information in World War II. In the category Learning and Teaching, there was advice on how to give advice in the context of the war, pointing out that advice can be harmful and that giving it is a major responsibility that should be taken seriously. We also identify a new trend that was not reported in prior work, which is offers for individual security and privacy consultations. These came from governments, non-profit organizations, companies, and individuals, and they included offers such as free individualized security and privacy advice or inspection of suspicious emails, texts, and websites. The other advice categories included authentication, which was focused around enabling or enforcing multi-factor authentication and having unique and strong passwords that one should ideally store in password managers. In the category Storing Data, advice focused on preserving data and preventing unwanted access. Advice here was very distinct between individuals and organizations. Advice for individuals was often specific recommendations for ad hoc actions, such as scanning or taking photos of all important documents. Advice for organizations was focused on professional data handling and included measures such as having and testing a backup and restore process. In the category Hardware and Software, advice centered around installing updates, installing security software, and device security. Advice on device security was addressed at individuals in Ukraine more often than other advice categories. It included locking devices to prevent unwanted access, as well as the tracking risks of connectivity features, such as Bluetooth, mobile connection, and GPS, such as in this example. Our final category are organizational policies. Advice here was usually directed at organizations in Western countries outside of Ukraine. It included changing network policies to be extra careful, especially with traffic that originated in Ukraine, as well as having and practicing incident response plans. To answer our second research question, we compare our taxonomy of advice to security and privacy advice collections from prior work. Reader et al. Collected advice for non-tech-savvy users in a survey with experts, and Boyd et al. Collected security and privacy advice that was shared around the Black Lives Matter protests. We compared our advice to both, finding some noteworthy similarities to the advice that experts gave to non-tech-savvy users, focused a lot around software updates and authentication. We find few overall similarities between our advice and that Boyd et al. Found in the context of the Black Lives Matter protests. However, we know that a lot of the advice that Boyd et al. Found belongs to categories that were mostly addressed at individuals inside Ukraine, such as device security. We additionally compared our taxonomy of advice to priority rankings of security and privacy advice from experts and users presented by Redmiles et al. And we find that advice that was frequent in our dataset scored high on the expert priority ranking. However, it also scored low on the user priority ranking, indicating that users perceive such advice as unactionable and not useful. I want to conclude my talk with some points from our discussion and some key takeaways. First off, the war significantly changed the threat landscape as well as resources available for protection. In times of war, security and privacy compete with other needs, such as financial and physical safety. However, given digital warfare, there is also a unique intersection between digital and physical safety. Most advice we found was generic, unactionable, and lacked prioritization and context, making it unsuitable to stay safe in war. We derive a need for actionable guidelines on security and privacy specific to times of war. We recommend that these be developed as a collaboration of security and privacy researchers and experts on safety and security in war zones. We believe that current guides for journalists in conflict zones can serve as a starting point. We find that offers for individual consultations on security and privacy are an exciting new supplement to written up guides. To avoid drawing resources from those affected by the war, we did not further investigate such offers. However, we see potential to address individual needs and threats, as well as potential problems such as quality of the offers and scalability. We thus recommend further research into the availability and quality of such offers, as well as the recipient's needs and expectations. Access to reliable information is critical in times of war. We find that misinformation is not only politically motivated, but also used as a tool to degrade security and privacy advice. Moreover, since also genuine advice was conflicting, it is even harder to spot misinformation. Most measures that were recommended were very time-consuming and thus hard to implement in a war situation. We see a need for reliable security and privacy advice distributed by trusted entities. So what are the key takeaways of this talk? First, we created a taxonomy of the security and privacy advice shared on Twitter related to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. We find a lack of prioritization and war-specific advice that needs to be remedied. We find that individual offers for security and privacy consultations are an exciting approach that warrants further research. And we find that misinformation remains a huge challenge that directly affects the quality of security and privacy advice. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I am now happy to take any questions.